Marvel's Thunderbolts sees the live-action debut of one of my favorite comic book characters of all time, Bob Reynolds, otherwise known to comic readers as the Sentry. What can I say? I am an absolute sucker for characters born of the Superman mold. However, within the genre, Sentry has a lot more to offer readers than most of the characters who were directly inspired by Superman. The Sentry, or Bob Reynolds, is a time-forgotten hero who holds within him the power of 1,000,000 exploding suns. In terms of powers, just name one. Whatever you're thinking, he probably has demonstrated that power at one point or another. Sounds like a pretty great guy to have on your side, right? Well, not always. See, Bob also has schizophrenia, anxiety, and agoraphobia. While mental health issues plague many superheroes, like the Hulk or Typhoid Mary, Bob's is unique in that it can manifest itself physically. Bob's mental illness combined with his insane array of uncontrolled powers gave birth to the Void, one of the most terrifying and destructive forces in Marvel Comics. Long opener, I know, but today I bring you the complete history of Bob Reynolds, aka the Sentry. The Sentry made his comic book debut in the Sentry #1, written by Paul Jenkins and drawn by Jae Lee. Bob Reynolds, an overweight alcoholic, wakes up from a dream convinced that he's a forgotten superhero and an old enemy of his named the Void had returned. Bob stumbles around his house, wondering how he got there, convinced his memories, sprinkled into the story as Silver Age comic panels, are his true past. In these memories, young Bobby gained powers by drinking a mysterious serum and became the Sentry. The Sentry battled his own villains, like the Blue Buffoon, and even saved the Avengers from his actual nemesis, the Void. Other memories inspired by various time periods of American comics imply that the Sentry required more and more of the serum in order to maintain his powers, and essentially he became addicted to it. Somehow, Bob comes to be in possession of this serum again, whether it had always been there or not, and began using it in secret, triggering hallucinations of the Void speaking through his dog Normie. With the re-emergence of the serum and his powers, his memories also slowly started to return. When Bob's wife Lindy discovered this, she mistook it for Bob drinking again. Feeling betrayed, she left him to stay with a friend. So Bob's worried about the return of the Void, so he decides to go on a journey to find out why has the world forgotten me. Bob puts together a makeshift costume, which is essentially a jacket with a torn cloth cape, and he sets out on his adventure. Now issues 2 through 5 of this miniseries is essentially Bob reconnecting with old friends, so I'm going to expand upon these as we go because they're actual one-shots that tie into these that build upon this even further. Bob, standing on top of a crane at the Baxter Building, is confronted by Reed Richards wondering who Bob is and how he got up there past his advanced security. Bob explains to Reed that nobody seems to remember him, including Reed himself. We see a flashback of Reed Richards acting as the best man to Bob at his own wedding long ago, a wedding that was attended by a literal who's who of Marvel heroes, implying that Sentry was well known and respected. Bob asks Reed to look for a unicorn that might help him remember, and he departs. Reed, back home with the Fantastic Four, finds a videotape under a unicorn decoration. The videotape contained a message from Reed himself warning of an impending invasion by the Void, also confirming Bob is the Sentry before the videotape bursts into flames unexpectedly. Bob next encounters Bruce Banner, trapped in Hulk form, who actually does remember him and cares for him deeply. Years ago, before everybody lost their memories of him, Bob had helped the Hulk control his anger. The golden glow of the Sentry created a calming effect on the Hulk, and the two acted almost as a duo for a period of time, even helping the Hulk become a beloved hero in the eyes of the public, instead of a rampaging monster. Hulk is informed of the Void's return, which shakes him to the core, implying that whoever or whatever the Void is must be incredibly powerful to worry even the Hulk, the strongest there is. Bob next encounters Spider-Man, who he refers to as Peter, which leads Spider-Man to believe that Bob is probably a new villain out to ruin his life. What else is new? So, you get the gist by now. Bob and Spider-Man 2 had a long history. Bob acted as a mentor to Spider-Man when he started out and pushed Spider-Man to act more heroic and less like a, smart-ass dick. Spider-Man was almost fearful of the Sentry, as Bob was viewed as this almost impossible standard of heroism. Bob eventually even helped him win a Pulitzer Prize by taking the first clear photo of the Sentry, as his golden glow prevented other heroes and news channels from capturing his appearance clearly. Lastly, Bob visits the X-Men, specifically Charles Xavier and Angel. Xavier is a very concerned man when it comes to Bob's reemergence, but what made him more concerned was that he didn't even know why he was afraid, with the other X-Men members saying that they had never seen Charles so shaken. Bob had also mentored Angel, now Archangel, when he was a young, brash hotshot of a hero more concerned with his bravado than his fellow X-Men on missions. The heroes collectively struggle with understanding how they could have forgotten somebody so important to the Marvel Universe and their lives, with pictures of the Sentry appearing blank, magazines featuring him being omitted from syndication, and the collective consciousness understanding that it's not that they don't remember Bob, but instead people are forbidden from remembering Bob, almost like he did something that forced everybody to forget him. The Sentry determines that there must be something preventing them from remembering. After disabling a transmitter being operated by an AI named Clock inside of the Sentry's base of operations, the Watchtower, the world as a whole slowly began to remember the Sentry. How was there a full-size Watchtower in New York that nobody saw? I just explained that, man. Stay with me here. Nobody can see the Sentry or remember stuff about him, okay? Anyway, as the world remembers the Sentry, the Void's presence begins to manifest as a hurricane, causing a tremendous amount of damage. Eventually, the heroes gather together, united by the Sentry, to take down the Void once and for all. As the Void makes landfall, thousands die, and there's a tremendous amount of damage. But as you may have anticipated by now, it's painfully deduced by Bob, Reed, and the other heroes the ultimate reason why the Sentry was forgotten in the first place. The Void and the Sentry are the same person. As the Sentry, Bob is the avatar of good, but his alternate persona, the Void, is the darker manifestation of all of his fears and hatred. And oh good, it's fueled by a nearly endless array of powers and abilities as well. Where the Sentry has nearly unlimited physical strength and a wide variety of additional powers showcased over hundreds of comics, the Void also has those same abilities and can use them for absolute chaos. The Sentry and the Void are one in the same, and you can't stop one without killing the other. The Sentry and the Void battle to a stalemate, but it's eventually determined that the only way to stop the Void is to erase the Sentry again. If the Sentry doesn't know he has these powers or about the Void at all, then the Void will just vanish along with the Sentry. The heroes collectively reactivate the transmitter that blocks the world from remembering the Sentry, and with that, Sentry is forgotten, and so is the Void. Or is he? You can't keep a good hero down for long, because just a few months later, Brian Michael Bendis brings the Sentry back into the fold in his New Avengers series. Following the complete mental collapse of the Scarlet Witch that leads to the death of Hawkeye and Ant-Man, the Avengers are disbanded. During the debut issue of New Avengers, the series sees Electro responsible for a massive assault on a superhuman prison in New York called the Raft that sees dozens of Marvel villains broken out of jail. Matt Murdock arrives at the Raft, hoping to meet with a client of his, and in the chaos of the explosions they find the imprisoned Sentry, having voluntarily committed himself after believing he had killed his own wife Lindy. Matt and Foggy are attacked during the chaos by Carnage, and Foggy begs Sentry to help keep him and his friends safe. Sentry yokes Carnage up, flies into space, and rips him in half like tissue paper. Yeah, dude, he absolutely does not play around. Sentry helps stop the chaos at the Raft, but then vanishes. Following the Raft incident a few issues later, Sentry is found isolated in a cave, begging for help in the form of the sweet release of death. Sentry claims that he killed his wife, but the Avengers arrive and inform him that she's still alive. Additionally, Marvel opted to write in the original writer, Paul Jenkins, as an in-world character, claiming that as far as the rest of the Marvel Universe was aware, the Sentry was only a fictional character created by Jenkins. Bob panics at all of this new, insane news, and he kind of teleports out of there in a big bang, awakening in his home, back in his regular day-to-day life as Bob Reynolds, seemingly forgetting that 30 seconds ago he was in a cave halfway around the world. Omega-level psychic mutant Emma Frost appears within Bob's mind and tells him that the life he is living and the memories he feels are all repressed memories. Something is going on inside of him, and she works with Bob to slowly unlock his mind. As Emma probes Bob's mind, looking for the root cause of this disassociation, Bob unknowingly unleashes the Void upon the combined forces of the Avengers, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Inhumans, and S.H.I.E.L.D. Emma is able to convince Bob to allow her to view a memory that Bob had locked away even from himself. This hidden, or I guess you could call it forbidden memory, tells the story of how Bob got so messed up. The archenemy of the Sentry was a man named the General, who hired another powerful psychic mutant named Jason Wingard, aka Mastermind and fellow Hellfire Club member with Emma Frost back in the history of X-Men. The General had Mastermind put a subliminal psychic virus within the Sentry's mind that caused him to be so afraid of using his powers that if he did use him, all of his fears of using them would manifest as the embodiment of death, the Void. As Bob is prone to doing, he panics at this new information and attempts to flee within his own mind, terrified of what he has done and what he could continue doing if they went further. So, Emma Frost brings Bob's wife Lindy's subconscious mind into Bob's and gains Bob's trust by allowing him to relive the day that Lindy and Bob fell in love, effectively reminding him of what he's fighting for. This breakthrough causes the Void, now unleashing hell on the heroes in the real world, to stop dead in its tracks. Bob finally embraces Emma's help and allows her to purge the virus from Bob's subconscious and unlocks all of his repressed memories at once. Following this breakthrough, Bob re-emerges, now free from the effects of Mastermind, and returns to being the Sentry once again. The team returns to Stark Tower to find that perched atop it is the Sentry's watchtower, where it's always been, but kept hidden by Bob's tremendous psychic power. The Sentry joins the new Avengers and enters the watchtower to take back the life he used to live once and for all. Or does he? The second solo Sentry series follows up on Bob's attempts to repress and control the Void. Bob begins a massive day-to-day campaign of heroism, saving thousands a day. To do this, he entrusts Clock, his artificial intelligence assistant supercomputer, to prioritize his heroism, which calculates the highest probabilities and the greatest chances for success. But Reynolds' psychological issues aren't actually getting any better. To contain the Void, the Sentry locks it in a vault within the watchtower. Bob hires a psychiatrist named Dr. Cornelius Worth, whom he has regular sessions with, but he often leaves those sessions early before confronting topics that he doesn't want to discuss. Clock, his supercomputer, growing concerned but unable to directly express those concerns due to his programming, advises Dr. Worth to enter the vault, where the Void is supposedly kept, only to find a chair and a mirror. He soon realizes that the Void is not actually imprisoned, and that the whole charade is a coping mechanism performed by the Sentry to deal with this darker half of his. Later, during a session, Dr. Worth confronts Reynolds with the truth, showing him a newspaper article that depicts the Sentry's heroic deeds alongside the Void's horrific actions, indicating that every positive action that the Sentry has, the Void overrides it by committing an equally heinous one. Bob starts to shift violently between his Sentry and Void personas, eventually leaping out the window. Dr. Worth follows him to a local fairgrounds, the same fairgrounds where Reynolds first gained his powers according to his memories, only to find that it's destroyed and evacuated. Dr. Worth confronts Reynolds, who's holding a gun now for some reason, warning him to leave. However, Dr. Worth persists, believing that Reynolds, despite his actions as the Void, is still trying to do good. In response, Reynolds splits into two entities, his Sentry and Void forms, revealing that the Void is his true persona and that the Sentry is the separate entity. Sentry explains that Bob Reynolds subconsciously hired the Doc to bring the truth out about his dual identities, or I guess we should say into the public eye. Dr. Worth inquires if the Sentry or the Void represents the real Bob Reynolds, to which Sentry responds that neither fully encompasses him, as the two personas don't really share the same memories. The Sentry also reveals that Reynolds initially gained his powers by stealing a serum from the Professor and pretended to be insane to keep the Void dormant. Bob ends up seeking help next from Doctor Strange, who uncovers that Sentry's life force is incomplete and that his memories are flawed. A mysterious voice in Sentry's mind tells him that he does not exist, and Doctor Strange warns him not to investigate this any further. Undeterred, the Sentry follows the clues in his memories, leading him to a destroyed base where the voice grows louder, claiming that he's not a hero, he's a murderer. Sentry blacks out, and when he wakes up, he's in a psychiatric facility under the name John Victor Williams, in the guise of a crazed patient who brutally killed his next-door neighbor, Melinda Jensen, whom the Sentry at first recognizes as his wife, Lindy Lee. The Sentry is able to break out of this elaborate illusion, and he realizes that he had been imprisoned and sedated in a secret facility run by Nick Fury with the help of Doctor Strange. There, the professor reveals that there is a bomb planted inside of him, preventing him from telling Bob any more about the truth. The professor is able to advise that Bob seek out the Void, though, who does know the truth and would be more than happy to tell him all about it. The bomb explodes, killing the professor, and the Sentry travels to the Void's Bizarro base in Antarctica. The Void tells Reynolds that he had actually taken a super secret, concentrated, exponentially more potent version of the super soldier formula that created Captain America, 100,000 times more potent to be exact. And unpacking that revelation, we get to the very core of Bob's fears. If a semi-ordinary nobody could become the greatest hero for good and the avatar of death and destruction, then allowing that formula to get out to the public could be cataclysmic. If Sentry's blood could be used to create more of the serum, it could be used to create enough for the entire world, a planet full of psychopath, near-omnipotent super beings. Enraged by this revelation, the Sentry throws the Void into the sun, telling his enemy that he no longer needs him to balance out his own actions of good. Alright, so let's see how long that lasts, shall we? Here's a quick hint. No matter how many times throughout Bob's comic history he thinks he rids himself of the Void, he always returns. It's an endless cycle, so just keep that in mind as we move through the rest of his history. I'm going to be like, oh, the Void's gone forever. He's not. He never is. So that all was technically kind of his origin story. So now we're going to get into the stories and crossovers that he's part of, but I'm not going to go in depth here as previously because Sentry acts more of a supporting character for the majority of the rest of these events, so I'm only going to cover the most essential elements of them so this video doesn't turn into a 5-hour deep cut. Bob's next significant appearance is during the massively successful crossover event Civil War that saw Captain America and Iron Man come to blows over the Superhuman Registration Act. Fear and paranoia had gripped the Marvel Universe following the events of Nick Fury's Secret War, and the Superhuman Registration Act was designed to kind of satiate the populace. Sentry was concerned about which side, if any, to join due to the overwhelming advantage he would provide to either side, so Bob did what he thought was best and stayed neutral for as long as he could. Sentry flees to the moon and spends a bit of time with the Inhumans, who initially attack him and learn that he used to have a romantic relationship with an Inhuman named Crystal. Iron Man comes to the moon and speaks with Bob about returning to Earth without getting a firm commitment from him. Following an attempt on Iron Man's life, however, in New Avengers, Sentry rushes to the aid of Stark, seemingly siding with Iron Man and helping end the conflict, although we don't see him fight much in order to avoid, the re-emergence of the Void. Following the events of Civil War, Sentry is recruited by Tony to be part of the Mighty Avengers. Our boy looks good back on a team, you know what I'm saying? Their first arc deals with a new threat in the form of Ultron, who takes over Tony Stark's body due to the nature of how Tony has integrated himself with his own battle armor. He also turns Tony into a girl. Girltron. Girltron hacks satellites Iron Man had developed that can manipulate the weather. Girltron planned to use them to make Earth uninhabitable, but upon finding this out, Sentry just immediately destroys them. In retaliation, Girltron's plan B is to head to Stark Tower where the Sentry's watchtower is and Bob's wife Lindy. Girltron stalls Sentry using a wave of Iron Man armors with the goal of not straight up defeating the hero, but buying Girltron enough time to kill Bob's wife, which Girltron does. She's dead now. Ultron killed Lindy. If I don't sound too heartbroken about that, you'll figure out why in a second. Sentry goes on a rampage afterward, fighting Ultron, while Hank Pym works double time to shrink down Ares, the god of war, and have him go into Girltron's system and install a virus. Time is crucial as Girltron has began firing nukes and is slowly gaining access to more in order to destroy the world. The group also has to fight the rampaging Sentry to give Ares enough time to install the virus and stop Ultron. Ares installs it, Wasp saves Ares, Girltron defeated. Tony returns. But what about Sentry and Lindy? Well, Lindy is alive again. Like I said, this man has powers. Lindy coming back to life has major implications for the couple because from this point onward, Lindy is somewhat fearful of her life with Bob. Bob just kinda subconsciously decided that Lindy wasn't dead, so she resurrects, and that's that. Knowing damn well that Sentry can hear incredibly well, Lindy asks Iron Man mere feet away from Bob to figure out how to either get rid of his powers or kill him once and for all. Next up, we have quite possibly the most influential Hulk storyline ever written, where we see the Hulk exiled into deep space, where he began an insurgence on a faraway planet called Skaar. After he was triumphant over the Red King, his new bride was killed accidentally by a bomb implanted in the ship used to exile Hulk, believed to be exploded by his former friends on Earth, the Illuminati. So Hulk decides to return to Earth, and it began an event known as World War Hulk that saw the Hulk attempt retribution against those that he believed wronged him. Iron Man, the President of the United States, and even the Invisible Woman all reach out to the Sentry to intervene, and while at first he seemed like he was down, he just kinda doesn't do anything at all. The dude just stands in his doorway for days on end staring out into nothing. However, Bob's agoraphobia prevents him from leaving. This is, one of those times where agoraphobia presents itself. He knows how strong the Hulk has become, and if Bob loses control of his powers for even a millisecond, it could result in the reemergence of the Void, and, the death of billions. Hulk, meanwhile, easily tears through Iron Man in a new Hulkbuster armor that culminates in the destruction of Avengers Tower, including Sentry's Watchtower. He then goes on to hand countless superheroes their collective asses. Reed Richards builds this device that tries to imitate the Sentry's golden glow, the one that calms the Hulk down, but it doesn't work, actually pisses him off. Eventually, after 4.5 issues of Marvel's heroes getting the piss beat out of them, the Sentry does decide to join the fight. The main reason he decides to join the fight is that he witnesses the Hulk throw the Illuminati into a gladiator pit to fight each other to the death using these obedience discs that were salvaged from Sakaar. Sentry joins the fight, claiming that it's time for him to play God, something Iron Man had told him before. Sentry arrives, destroying the Hulk's base, his ship, the gladiator pit, and a bunch of buildings. This is like the first time that we actually get to see the Sentry truly unleashed, and the battle is insane. It's just them whipping each other's asses. The two eventually fight to the point of complete exhaustion and revert back to Bruce Banner and Bob Reynolds. Hulk learns that he was actually tricked into believing a lie as well, and that the Illuminati were not responsible for his alien wife dying. It was actually Meek. Yeah, remember Meek? This is what he looks like in the comics. Anyway, it was all a big misunderstanding and a double cross from Meek, so Hulk stops this giant orbital blast from killing Tony Stark, and then he turns himself in. He gets apprehended. Following the events of World War Hulk, Sentry goes back to his role within the Mighty Avengers, next appearing prominently in the Secret Invasion storyline. Secret Invasion details the assault on Earth by the Skrull Kreen Varanki, when it was found that a number of high-profile heroes had been replaced with Skrull imposters over a period of time leading up to this wave of paranoia. The Skrulls did a bunch of research on Earth undetected for months, potentially years setting this up. A Skrull embedded itself into the Avengers compound pretending to be Jarvis to get access to the Sentry's file. A Skrull ship crash lands into the Savage Land, and the Mighty Avengers head there to check it out unauthorized. Bob travels with Iron Man to stop them, and a wave of Skrull attacks and sabotages break out all over the globe. Iron Man has this crazy seizure in his armor caused by an alien virus, and the Skrull ship opens to unleash more than a dozen Skrull imposters, all disguised as Marvel's Apex heroes. As this battle in the Savage Land unfolds, the Sentry desperately tries to plea with a Skrull disguised as the Vision. However, this vision scroll morphs into the Void, and he boogeymans his way out of the situation. He tells Bob that the entire scenario is his fault, and that somehow it's all Bob manifesting this conflict to kill everybody for forgetting him years ago. Bob bobs out of the situation, aka he flees to Saturn, where he cries in the fetal position, having a complete mental breakdown, hoping that he's far enough away from Earth to stop what he now believes is the Void / himself from killing everybody. I hope you're picking up on this. We have to remove the Sentry from this story somehow because he's so strong he would just wipe the floor with everybody, so we're gonna scare him into thinking that it's the Void all along kind of thing, because that's how it goes a lot of the time. Remember how earlier we discussed Bob's marital strains, like his wife, wanting him dead or depowered? Well, let's get back to that. These themes were explored a bit further in Secret Invasion and Dark Avengers. Secret Invasion ultimately ends with Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin of all people, killing the Skrull Queen Veranke. Combining this with the now completely eroded trust in most superheroes thanks to the Skrulls impersonating them, and you have a recipe that allows Norman Osborn to completely take over nearly everything in the Marvel Universe during the events of Dark Reign, which spawned the series Dark Avengers. The Dark Avengers were mostly a team of villains donning the mantles of popular Marvel heroes. Norman was Iron Patriot, Bullseye became Hawkeye, Daken was Wolverine, Moonstone became Miss Marvel, Noh-Varr became Captain Marvel, and now add in Ares and the Sentry and you round out the group, wham boom bam, Dark Avengers. Why would Bob join these villains? Well, we see that in Dark Avengers 13. The circumstances that allowed Norman to gain the Sentry's trust. To do that, all Norman had to do was recreate the Sentry serum, and it only works on Bob. Like an addict, Bob becomes loyal to Norman. However, he doesn't really technically need this serum. It's something that he takes like an addict, but he doesn't need it to exhibit his powers. On their very first mission, they saw Morgan Le Fay battling Doctor Doom, and Norman authorizes Sentry to fly into the battle and requests that he doesn't hold back. So he Mortal Kombat style rips her head off. The worst part is that Bob is so messed up by this point that he doesn't even know if killing a villain is a bad thing. And worse off, Norman's like, yes, Bob, it's good that you murdered her in the most savage way possible, brother. Good job. Well, that is until Morgan somehow travels back from the past and explodes Bob into a million pieces. And Bob stays dead for almost 2 whole issues. Because after the defeat of Morgan, the Dark Avengers return to the Watchtower and Bob just kind of explodes back into reality like nothing happened, terrifying the rest of the team. In issue 9 and 10, he's sent to research Dinosaur, Colorado, where people, including a politician's daughter, were going missing thanks to a pretty beefy cabal of villains: Molecule Man, Zarathos, Mephisto, and a couple others, I don't care. And here the Sentry explodes again, violently. Rest in peace, brother. Except he's actually kept alive by the Molecule Man, tearing him apart over and over. He seriously dies like 10 times in the next few issues, but ultimately, he learns how to control molecules himself and stops the assault. I just wanted to discuss that as it illustrates how completely cracked he becomes. A lot of the events that take place during issues 9 and 13 come back during the crossover event Siege, which details the events of the Siege of Asgard by Loki and Norman Osborn. A lot of what I'm discussing is spread out throughout the events of this crossover, and with it is some pretty weird timing and it's a bit mucky, but as far as Siege goes, without getting too far into it, Asgard, now located on Earth, is one of the last holdouts in Norman's consolidation of power, and Loki is able to manipulate the situation, allowing a full assault from Norman on New Asgard. Sentry is part of this siege, and he's especially ruthless throughout this entire time in the battle. In issue 13 of Dark Avengers, it details how months previously, in desperation, Lindy shot Bob in the face with a high-powered weapon believed to have killed him. She was relieved, as Bob had told her about his secret origins of addiction, how he got the serum, and all that stuff, and she laments how her life with Bob has turned out. The Void manifests out of Sentry's corpse and threatens to kill her. This causes Bob to fly himself into the sun to commit suicide in order to end both the Void and the Sentry, but he's unsuccessful. The Void asks Sentry to really consider how much good he's ever done in his role as the Sentry, and how normally his involvement just makes everything worse. Meanwhile, the Void's actions, while horrific, usually result in some type of cataclysmic lasting change. Sentry breaks, and he gives control to the Void. After a short period of time, he returns to Earth in one of the hardest panels ever drawn, goddamn. The Void was planning on causing so much death and so much carnage that Lindy and Bob would never even want to live in the world and fully relinquish control to the Void forever. Norman is able to talk the Void down from the ledge by implying that Reed Richards, Tony Stark, and the others would stop at nothing to destroy both the Sentry and the Void, and if he didn't rethink it, good chance that he was gonna die because they always win. He calms down and ends his assault, agreeing to work with Norman during the events of Siege. So it's kind of ambiguous who's behind the wheel during Siege. Sometimes it's the Void, sometimes it's Sentry, but they look identical. The only time you can really tell them apart is when you see black dialogue from the Sentry. Sentry fights alongside Norman during the Siege of Asgard along with the Dark Avengers, and he murders Ares, who had switched sides after learning of Norman's motivations for taking over Asgard. However, Iron Man, Captain America, and a number of true Avengers return to aid Asgard, and Iron Man shuts down Norman's stolen armor, triggering Norman to panic and ask the Sentry to kind of unleash himself. Thor has to then battle the Void, and Bob destroys nearly all of New Asgard in an instant, and he's shown floating above the remains in another insanely hard splash page. We'll come back to this in a second though. Dark Avengers 15, though, shows how the Sentry became so completely untethered. 2 days before the siege, Norman, in the cover of night, goes to Bullseye, the goat, and tells him to kill Sentry's wife Lindy when the time is right. Norman then creates a diversion by unleashing the Void against Doom, and a battle breaks out. Norman requests that the Void relinquish control back to Bob and act as the Sentry to be a hero. This is a cover to get Bob out of the local area, knowing that Bullseye was going to take Lindy to safety. Bullseye flies Lindy out into the middle of the ocean, strangles her to death, and dumps her body at sea. Then he returns. Bullseye comes back and lies straight to Bob's face, telling him that Lindy had committed suicide and he wasn't able to stop her. Bob freaks out and nearly kills everybody there, including Bullseye, who's able to lie his ass out of that scenario using god-level manipulation. He's like, you guys had all these ongoing problems, it creates a bunch of reasonable doubt, and Sentry flies off. Back in the main Siege event, Loki, witnessing the error of his ways and the destruction of Asgard, aids the heroes using the power of the Norn Stones, which amps their power, allowing them to fight the Void. However, the Void kills Loki violently, like he's absolutely nothing. That also removes the buff. So Iron Man does what any good Iron Man would do, and he crashes the shield helicarrier into the Void. The damage inflicted causes the Void to revert back to regular old Bob. Seeing the damage and the carnage he's created, he begs for Thor to kill him. Thor is able to kill the weakened Sentry with a mighty final blow. Thor then gathers his corpse and flies it to the sun, dumping it in there. But we all know you can't keep the Sentry dead for long. After Thor drops Bob into the sun, the Sentry isn't seen again in comics for a few years, giving the general Marvel universe a brief break from his psychopathy. But in comes Rick Remender, one of my personal favorite writers from the mid-2000s X-Men books. Rick brings the Sentry back into the fold in his Uncanny Avengers run, specifically in issue 9. And I'm going to keep this one far shorter, but it's still very cool. Following the Avengers vs. X-Men, the two groups form a unity team of the Uncanny Avengers as a way to help bridge the fractured relationship between the groups who were just at war a few months prior. Later in the series, we see the emergence of the Apocalypse Twins, who resurrect the Sentry using one of the classic Death Seeds. These were used by the legendary comic villain Apocalypse, who previously used these same Death Seeds many times throughout comic history to create his Horsemen of the Apocalypse, specifically the Horseman Death. Sentry explains that he was thrown into the sun and he kept regenerating down to an atom only to die over and over again, a cycle which he claims caused the Void to grow bored and leave him. The twins somehow recovered him from the sun and used the Death Seed to reanimate and kind of enslave him, naming him their Horseman of Death, and giving him the classic blue color. He's primarily used as muscle in this series, without a lot of deep introspective character growth. He does, however, mop the floor with Thor, Wasp, and a ton of others, but his significant action is towards the end of this series. The long and short of this series involved time travel and alternate realities, but the culmination sees the Uncanny Avenger Rogue absorb the powers of every other member of the team in order to stop a celestial executioner named Exitar from destroying the world, which technically it does earlier in the series. So in order to undo the death of the planet and everybody on it, they have to go back in time. You know, typical X-Men time travel bullshit. Sentry spends most of this run as an antagonist, but he, facing the certain destruction of Earth, flips the script and adopts the mentality that he is still the chosen protector of humanity. So there's this scene of Rogue holding one foot of the Celestial and Sentry holding the other, desperately trying to stop it from making landfall on Earth. It's just an 11 out of 10 badass run, and Rick Remender cooked so hard in Uncanny X-Force and Uncanny Avengers. Sentry's appearances within this series, though, do end at issue 22 after they defeat Exitar. Sentry tells Wasp that he enjoyed being Avenger again, although briefly, and he would take it upon himself to move the Celestial's body far away from Earth so that the remaining Celestials don't get wind of their dead brethren. Now, at this point, it's kind of weird because we don't see Sentry for a while. Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, New Avengers, Secret Wars happen. There's a complete remake of the Marvel Universe, and Sentry is basically nowhere to be seen during all those events during that whole time frame. However, during the Doctor Strange run, we're about to discuss exactly what happened to the Sentry, where he was during that time, and why he was absent from so many mega events. The Sentry's next appearance is in the Marvel Legacy numbering of Doctor Strange, which we see the title of Sorcerer Supreme being won by Loki, who was given that title by the Vishanti after they lost faith in Strange. Although technically it was just kind of an illusion that Loki presented to Strange that allowed Loki to become the Sorcerer Supreme without actually having to beat Strange for that title. Loki starts searching for a spell, the Exile of Sing Soon, that would siphon all magic from the magical beings in the world to him, a nuclear launch code of magic. Doctor Strange, now a practicing veterinarian, travels to the top of a mountain where he finds and recruits our boy Bobby Reynolds, the Sentry. He's back, baby! Strange travels to Asgard and borrows the magic of the World Tree Yggdrasil to battle Loki. Loki's astonished that Strange can handle that level of magic as it would kill a normal mortal. Effectively, think about it like this. Classically speaking, all magic has to be paid for in one way or another. Strange and Wong use Sentry's immense strength and durability as that payment. Strange is free to use as much magic as he needs, and Bob just takes the brunt of that destructive side, but to him it's basically nothing. Strange and Loki battle, with them both briefly being able to not use magic, and Loki ends up gaining the upper hand because Loki is still more physically powerful without magic. He's a god after all, and he forces Steven to open a locked door within the Sanctum Sanctorum that Loki had been trying desperately to enter in order to potentially gain access to that spell I mentioned earlier. However, locked inside the door was the Void, who, if you recall, killed Loki during Siege, so yeah, he is shooketh, as the Asgardians might say. The Void claims that after Sentry was made a horseman and carried the celestial body of Exitar into space, he just wandered the cosmos for years trying to die, eventually begging the Void to kill him. Somehow Strange was able to lock the Void away within this chamber in the Sanctum Sanctorum, and the Sentry was free to live his life without the repercussions of what the Void always does. The group battles the Void, requiring Loki to use the Exile of Sing Soon to become strong enough to force the Void back into the chamber. However, the damage is done between Steven and the Sentry. Sentry doesn't trust him anymore and asks Steven to never contact him again. Which is pretty weird because in the Sentry Volume 3, following telling Doctor Strange to never contact him again, somehow Doctor Strange has built a device for Bob called the Conflicator, and that allows Bob to enter a pocket dimension once every 24 hours and act freely as both the Sentry and the Void. Within this pocket dimension, nothing that Bob does matters, and when he exits the dimension, he's just regular old Bob, living a somewhat normal but structured life under the watch of S.H.I.E.L.D. But Bob's former sidekick, Billy Turner, aka Scout, now a diner cook whom Bob works with and confides in, steals the Conflicator, in a ploy to steal the Sentry's powers and become the new Sentry. Scout sweet-talks his way into obtaining the original professor's notes of how to create the Sentry formula from the niece of the now-deceased professor who created that formula. Billy recruits one of the Sentry's old villains named Cranio to duplicate that serum while simultaneously having Cranio hack into the Sentry's world, with the promises of restoring this once proud mad scientist to his former glory. Scout takes the serum and becomes the new Sentry, kinda. He has some of the abilities, but not the full array displayed by Bob. Bob and Scout do battle, with Bob eventually determining that he needs to merge with the Void in order to become something greater than he had ever become. This new Sentry, with a slightly different color scheme, easily beats Scout, eventually breaking his neck, killing him. The Avengers then arrive in order to apprehend Sentry, including Iron Man, who had already fought Bob once in this run in new MCU-inspired Hulkbuster armor. But the entire Avengers roster gets dog-walked. Sentry eventually leaves the planet by his own choice because frankly there's nothing that the Avengers could do to stop him from doing whatever he wants to do. Struggling to understand his new sense of self, the Sentry returns to Earth and unknowingly warps reality around him while meditating, engulfing the entire town of Pawhuska in a dangerous energy field that kind of attacks intruders with monsters and illusions. This dark energy was detected by Black Panther and the agents of Wakanda. The energy was eventually purged from the Sentry's body by the immortal weapon, the Fat Cobra, similar to Iron Fist, but, Fat Cobra. And he eats this entire energy, rolls it up into a little bite-sized marble and eats it like a tiny dark energy Snickers. After all the pain he caused in Pawhuska, Bob flies back to his old BFF, Reed Richards, and asks him to figure out, please, how to separate him from the Void once and for all. But Reed finds that within our universe, using our laws of physics, there was just no way. Reed determines, though, that perhaps within the negative zone, using their negative cosmic rays, the Sentry could be separated from the Void. So Bob goes into the negative zone. In Annihilation Scourge, the Silver Surfer, Bob was found, but he was there powerless. Bob explains that the Void left him, and it was so powerful that it came to rule over this negative universe and its creatures within. So Silver Surfer's obviously very concerned with the Void's growing influence within the negative zone, and specifically the beings from the Cancerverse, so Surfer decides to merge with Bob to become the Silver Sentry. I don't know, that was the best name I could come up with. But Ben Grimm does call him that in the next issue, so I am vindicated. Nova and a ton of other heroes arrive to assist the combined might of the Silver Sentry, Fantastic Four, and the Negative Zone citizens. The plan morphs to have Bob merge with the Void again and end the invasion of the Negative Zone by the Cancerverse. The goal was to have the Void call off the invasion, but the Void realizes that he was never really the leader of the Negative Zone and the Cancerverse, and its true goal was to get back the one being who had escaped it, Nova. So Nova ends up leading the Cancerverse back to this point called the Bleak. It's kind of where the two verses collide. And Nova absorbs the entire verse into himself. Then the merged Sentry kills Nova, ending the conflict. Sentry remained behind to watch over the entire Negative Zone, not particularly interested in coming back to our universe. But, sprawling out of the pages of Venom, the massive crossover event, The King in Black, comes, and it saw this eldritch being known as Null, the god of the Void, and the king of the symbiotes come to Earth to take retribution on Venom. And enslave, destroy the entire universe. Pretty standard stuff. Null, riding a symbiote-covered Celestial, emerges from inside the space god and demands that Eddie Brock come out and face him. With Earth's defenses failing, they called in their biggest possible gun, the Sentry. Bob Reynolds, back from the Negative Zone to help him. Sentry flies through the Celestial symbiote, grabs Null and flies him into the atmosphere, and he kind of starts talking a little bit of shit, That is, until Null stops him mid-sentence and rips him in half in orbit to the shock and horror of everybody looking on below. Then, much to everybody's terror, Null also absorbs the Void, which nobody thought was possible. Null is eventually destroyed by Eddie, who merges with the Enigma Force, which is kind of like the spirit of life in the Marvel Universe, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, after his death, the Sentry becomes a ghost, unable to move on to the afterlife. His ghost speaks with the new Valkyrie, Jane Foster, about his life and his demise at the hands of Null. On their way to Valhalla, they encounter a headless Celestial in the realm between, corrupted by All Black, the necro sword that Null wields. Despite their efforts, the Celestial absorbed the Sentry's soul. However, there's this kind of really cool ritual that Brunhild, Evenir, and Danny Moonstar along with Valkyrie perform, which kind of severs their connection to that Celestial. So now that he's at peace, feeling whole at last, the Sentry moves on to the afterlife, finally committing to being dead. And that, my friends, is the very long and complicated history of the Sentry. Now, following the Sentry's soul moving on, it does end up being split between other humans in a newer miniseries called, shockingly, Sentry. However, those are different characters, so I've chosen to omit that from this video, but there is a new Sentry. Her name is Solaris. The Sentry is a tremendously powerful character, so powerful that writers often had to create unique ways to completely nerf him or remove him from most of the conflicts he's in so that he doesn't end them immediately. He's absolutely one of my favorite characters and completely overcomplicates every story he gets wrapped up in. I hope you learned a lot. This is my longest video ever, so if you enjoy it and are still here, please share it with others on social media, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. This has been Nick for Key Issues. Thank you so much for watching this video, and remember the motto, the Sentry over everything.